This story is usually explained in simple terms: isolation, desperation, human nature under pressure. The implication is clear that what happened was unavoidable, but inevitability is a convenient word. It removes responsibility. This is not a story about what happened. It is a story about what was allowed to happen. Chapter 1: A perfectly ordinary voyage. In the spring of 1628, the Batavia leaves the Dutch Republic not as a vessel marked by misfortune, but as a product of confidence, planning, and institutional certainty. Built for long voyages and heavy cargo, the ship represents the reach and discipline of a global trading system that believes itself both rational and durable. On board are officers trained to command, sailors accustomed to obedience, soldiers assigned to enforce order, and civilians who trust that the structure surrounding them will function as intended. Nothing about the departure suggests instability. The hierarchy is clear, the rules are understood, and the voyage follows routes already traveled many times before. Days at sea settle quickly into routine. Watches are kept, supplies are rationed, discipline is maintained. Life aboard the Batavia is not easy, but it is predictable, and predictability has a way of creating its own sense of safety. When people know what to expect, they rarely examine the foundations that make that expectation possible. The ship's authority structure appears solid, yet it is also distant. Orders flow downward, responsibility upward, and most passengers exist somewhere in between, with little reason to question how decisions are made or who ultimately bears the consequences of making them. At this stage, danger is imagined as something external, something that arrives from outside the system: a storm, a navigational error, an enemy ship. These are familiar risks, accounted for in training and experience. They are the kinds of threats people believe they understand. What is not considered is how quickly order depends on presence, and how fragile it can become when that presence is removed. Beneath the routines of daily life, small tensions already exist. Personal grievances, ambitions, and resentments travel quietly with the ship, largely invisible against the broader machinery of command. They do not yet matter, because there is no space for them to matter. Authority fills that space completely, and when authority feels absolute, it is rarely questioned. The Batavia's passengers trust not only the ship, but the system it represents, assuming that rules will continue to apply simply because they always have. That assumption is subtle, almost unconscious, but it shapes every interaction on board. People comply because compliance has always been rewarded. They defer because deferral has always been safe. At no point does anyone ask what happens if the system pauses, or who benefits if it does. History often treats voyages like this as preludes, calm stretches before inevitable catastrophe. But calm itself can obscure more than it reveals. Stability discourages scrutiny. When nothing appears wrong, there is no reason to look closely. The Batavia moves steadily across open water, carrying wealth, authority, and expectation in equal measure. Its passengers believe they are part of something larger than themselves, something ordered and controlled, and that belief shapes their behavior more effectively than fear ever could. Yet systems do not fail all at once. They weaken in silence, through assumptions left untested and power left unexamined. At this point in the journey, there is no violence, no panic, no sign of collapse. There is only confidence, reinforced by routine, and the quiet agreement that someone else is responsible for maintaining order. Few consider how dependent that order is on the continuous presence of leadership, or how quickly obedience can transform when oversight disappears. The voyage continues without incident, and with every uneventful day, the sense that this journey will be no different from countless others grows stronger. That sense of normality becomes its own kind of shelter, convincing those on board that whatever lies ahead will unfold within familiar boundaries. It is easy, under such conditions, to mistake structure for permanence and authority for inevitability. The Batavia does not sail toward chaos knowingly. It sails toward it with confidence, carrying people who believe that the rules governing their world are fixed, impartial, and resilient. At this moment, nothing challenges that belief. No one suspects that the most important question of the voyage has already been answered without being asked. Not what will happen if the ship fails, but what will happen if the system holding everyone together quietly steps aside. Chapter 2. Impact without collapse. The moment the Batavia strikes the reef is sudden, but not explosive. There is no storm, no dramatic warning, no violent struggle against the sea. The ship simply runs out of water beneath it, grinding against coral in the early hours of the morning. With splinters, the hull opens, and seawater begins to enter the lower decks. Panic is expected in moments like this, yet what follows is something far more restrained. Orders are given. Boats are lowered. Cargo is moved. People shout, but they listen. The structure that governed life on board only hours earlier does not disappear. It continues, almost automatically, as if disaster itself were another routine to be managed. Most of the passengers survive the initial impact. Supplies are recovered. Weapons, tools, food, and water are carried ashore to nearby low islands. From a distance, the situation appears grim but stable. This is not a total loss. The ship is damaged beyond saving, but the people are alive, and that fact alone shapes how events are interpreted. Survival changes expectations. Once death does not arrive immediately, confidence begins to return. People assume that whatever comes next will follow known patterns. Wait, endure, be rescued. The sea has delivered its blow, and now, it seems, its role is finished. Camps are established. Groups are organized. The division between sailors, soldiers, and civilians remains intact. Even without walls or roofs, hierarchy persists. At this stage, no one believes they are witnessing the beginning of something worse than a shipwreck. In fact, many believe the worst has already passed. That belief is quiet, but powerful. When people survive an obvious danger, they often stop looking for less visible ones. Days pass without immediate catastrophe. Food is limited, but not gone. Water is scarce, but available. The islands are harsh, yet not immediately lethal. From a purely logistical perspective, the situation appears manageable for a short time. The expectation of rescue fills the gaps left by uncertainty. This expectation does more than comfort. It delays difficult questions. No one is forced to decide who holds authority in the long term, because the long term is assumed to be brief. No one challenges decisions, because those decisions are framed as temporary. The idea that this state might last weeks or months does not fully register. And because of that, no one yet examines how fragile cooperation can become once urgency fades. The survivors are not unified by fear, but by habit. They continue to behave as though they are still part of a functioning system, even though the physical structure of that system now lies broken offshore. This is a critical moment, though it does not feel like one. The shipwreck has removed the environment that enforced order, but not the assumptions that order will continue. People follow instructions because they expect instruction to continue arriving. They defer because deferral has always been rewarded. At no point does anyone formally redefine roles or responsibilities. The absence of chaos is mistaken for stability. This misunderstanding will matter later. For now, the scene remains deceptively calm. The dead are few. The living are many. Nothing about the camps suggests intentional harm. If deaths occur, they can be explained. Weakness, exposure, accident. These explanations feel sufficient, and because they feel sufficient, they are not questioned. In survival situations, meaning is often assigned quickly, not because it is accurate, but because it is comforting. The Batavia's survivors believe they understand what kind of story they are now part of. They believe it is a familiar one, and familiarity reduces vigilance. What no one recognizes yet is that survival itself has created a pause, a space in which authority is present but undefined, power exists but unaccounted for, and actions can occur without immediate scrutiny. The reef has done its damage and withdrawn. The sea is no longer the primary threat. But the absence of an external enemy does not create safety. It creates ambiguity. And ambiguity, left unattended, has consequences. At this stage, nothing openly signals what is coming. There is no moment to point to and say this is where it began. That is precisely why this phase matters. The collapse has not happened. The violence has not begun. What exists instead is a fragile calm built on assumptions that no longer have physical support. The survivors wait, confident that the structure which guided them across oceans will somehow continue to function on bare sand. They do not yet understand that systems do not survive impact simply because people expect them to. The Batavia has broken apart, but the belief in order remains intact. And for now, that belief is enough to keep everything quiet. Chapter 3. When authority leaves the island. The moment authority leaves the island does not feel dramatic, and that is precisely why it matters. The decision to send a small boat in search of help is logical, even reassuring. It signals action, competence, and continuity with the system everyone still believes in. The captain departs with the expectation that rescue will follow, and those left behind interpret this departure not as abandonment, but as a temporary absence. The assumption is simple: authority has gone elsewhere, but it still exists. Yet authority is not an idea, it is a presence. And once that presence disappears, the rules that depended on it begin to loosen, quietly and unevenly. No announcement is made declaring who is now in charge. No formal transition occurs. Instead, people continue behaving as if the previous structure is still operating, even though its central figure is now over the horizon. This creates a subtle vacuum, one that is not immediately noticed because daily routines continue. Supplies are distributed. Camps remain organized. Orders are followed, but they are followed out of habit rather than enforcement. In the absence of clear leadership, influence begins to replace authority. Those who speak with confidence are listened to. Those who appear decisive are deferred to. At first, this shift seems harmless. Someone needs to coordinate tasks. Someone needs to make practical decisions. The difference between leadership and control is not yet visible because no one is openly resisting. Most people are still cooperative, still expecting resolution. This expectation delays scrutiny. It discourages questions about who benefits from certain decisions and who bears their consequences. Over time, small changes become noticeable, though they are rarely named. Certain individuals gain access to supplies more easily. Certain voices are heard more often. Others withdraw, either by choice or discomfort. None of this appears threatening in isolation. It looks like adaptation. It looks like people stepping up in a difficult situation. What is not recognized is that authority, once informal, no longer answers to anyone. There are no records, no oversight, no external correction. Decisions can be made without justification, and the absence of immediate consequences reinforces confidence in those making them. This is the stage where power becomes personal rather than institutional. It is also the stage most easily overlooked in hindsight, because it lacks spectacle. No violence has occurred. No rules have been openly broken. The system has not collapsed. It has thinned. People still believe they are living under the old order, even as that order quietly dissolves. The islands themselves contribute to this illusion. Their separation fragments the group physically, making collective awareness more difficult. Information travels slowly and unevenly. What happens on one island is not always visible on another. This isolation allows narratives to form independently, shaped by whoever speaks most confidently in each place. Trust, once distributed across a hierarchy, begins to concentrate. And trust, when concentrated without accountability, becomes dangerous. At this point, no one believes they are surrendering control. They believe they are maintaining stability. That belief is sincere. It is also wrong. The departure of authority does not create chaos immediately. It creates opportunity. Opportunity for organization, yes, but also for manipulation. And because this transition happens without conflict, it is rarely resisted. People comply because compliance still feels safe. They defer because deferral still seems reasonable. The absence of force makes the emerging imbalance harder to detect. This is not the moment where the story turns violent. It is the moment where violence becomes possible. Later, it will be tempting to point to specific acts and say this is where everything went wrong. But the conditions that allow those acts to occur are being established now, in quiet conversations, unchallenged decisions, and the gradual redefinition of who speaks for whom. Authority has not vanished entirely. It has simply stopped being visible. And when authority is invisible, it can be replaced by something far less constrained. The survivors continue to wait for rescue, unaware that the structure meant to protect them has already left, and that what remains is not leadership, but the appearance of it. Nothing feels broken yet. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. Chapter 4. Deaths that make sense. The first deaths do not shock anyone. They arrive quietly, spaced out, and each one appears to have a reasonable explanation. Someone grows weak and does not recover. Someone collapses after days of limited water. Someone wanders away and is later found lifeless under the sun. These are the kinds of outcomes people expect in harsh conditions, and expectation shapes interpretation. No alarms are raised, because nothing seems out of place. The survivors have already accepted that not everyone will make it. That acceptance becomes a filter through which every event is viewed. Each death is absorbed into a familiar narrative of exposure, exhaustion, and bad luck. What matters is not that people are dying, but that their deaths feel understandable. When causes appear obvious, investigation feels unnecessary. This is how meaning settles too quickly. The environment provides a convincing explanation for loss, and because it does, no one looks beyond it. At this stage, there is still trust. Trust that events are unfolding naturally. Trust that no one would deliberately make the situation worse. Trust that what is happening is simply the cost of survival. This trust discourages suspicion. It keeps questions unformed. People grieve briefly, then adjust. The camps continue to function. Supplies are redistributed. Roles shift slightly, but nothing is formally challenged. Death becomes part of the background, acknowledged but not examined. This is not cruelty, it is adaptation. Human beings are capable of accepting almost anything if it arrives slowly and makes sense. What no one considers is how easily plausibility can be used as cover. Once death is normalized, it stops being remarkable. Once it stops being remarkable, patterns can hide inside it. The survivors are not indifferent, they are pragmatic. They believe that focusing on causes they cannot control, the heat, the lack of water, the isolation, allows them to endure without falling apart. And in many survival stories, that belief would be correct. Here, it is dangerously incomplete. Small changes in behavior go unnoticed. Certain individuals are moved away from shared camps. Certain supplies become harder for some to access. Certain explanations are offered quickly, confidently, and without contradiction. These explanations are accepted because they align with what everyone already believes. No one wants to imagine malice when exhaustion offers a simpler answer. And so, the deaths continue to be understood as consequences, not decisions. The absence of visible violence reinforces this interpretation. There are no public confrontations, no screams, no scenes that demand attention. Everything happens at the edges, out of sight, or after the fact. Bodies are found, not witnessed. Stories are told, not questioned. In environments like this, certainty belongs to whoever speaks first, and the first explanation is often the one that survives. This is the most fragile phase of the entire story, though it rarely appears that way in retrospect. It is the moment when the line between accident and intention blurs, not because evidence is missing, but because no one is looking for it. The survivors believe they are still dealing with nature. They believe the danger remains external. That belief shapes their emotional response. They mourn, but they do not resist. They adapt, but they do not confront. Deaths that make sense do not provoke action. They provoke resignation. And resignation creates space. Space for authority to harden without being noticed. Space for decisions to be made without being challenged. Space for explanations to become shields. Later, it will be easy to identify when violence became systematic. But that clarity only exists in hindsight. In the moment, nothing about these early deaths demands a different story. They fit too neatly into expectations. And because they fit, they are accepted. This chapter of the Batavia story is not about cruelty revealed, but about how easily human reasoning can be guided by context. When people believe they understand why something happened, they rarely ask whether it had to happen at all. The deaths feel inevitable. They feel tragic, but ordinary. And it is precisely that ordinariness that allows the next phase to begin without resistance. No one yet realizes that what makes sense is not always what is true. Chapter 5. Violence becomes a system. At some point, death stops arriving by chance. It does not announce this change, and it does not require a dramatic event to mark the transition. It simply begins to follow a pattern. People disappear more frequently. Not the strongest, not the weakest. Specific individuals. Those who question decisions. Those who seem less useful. Those who exist at the margins of the group. The explanations remain familiar, but they are delivered faster now. with more confidence and less discussion. Illness, exposure, accident. These words still work because they have worked before. What changes is not the story being told, but who controls it. Authority, once informal, begins to harden. Access to food and water is no longer equal. Movement between camps becomes restricted. Some people are sent away under the pretense of safety or necessity and never return. Others are isolated, their absence explained only after it becomes permanent. No one witnesses the acts themselves. Violence is efficient because it is private. There are no confrontations that might force the group to choose sides. There is no single moment where everyone realizes what is happening. Instead, there is a gradual narrowing of acceptable behavior. Questions become dangerous. Silence becomes practical. Compliance becomes survival. This is how violence becomes systematic, not through chaos, but through administration. Decisions are framed as logistical. Death is framed as unfortunate but necessary. The language of survival absorbs the language of harm. At this stage, the people who still sense that something is wrong struggle to articulate it. There is no clear rule to point to, no single order that can be challenged. Power operates through implication rather than command. It does not need to threaten openly, because its effects are already visible. People learn by watching what happens to those who do not adapt. Fear spreads without being named. It settles into routines. It reshapes priorities. Moral boundaries shift not because people abandon them, but because maintaining them becomes costly. The system rewards obedience with safety and punishes deviation with disappearance. Importantly, this system does not rely on mass participation. Most people are not actively violent. Most are simply trying to survive within the conditions that now exist. That is what makes the system stable. Responsibility is diffused. Each individual action can be justified in isolation. Someone follows an instruction. Someone withholds information. Someone looks away. No one feels fully responsible, and so no one feels fully guilty. From the outside, it might appear that order has returned. Camps are quieter. Fewer disputes occur. Resources are controlled more tightly. But this is not stability. It is consolidation. Violence has become predictable, and predictability reduces resistance. The absence of visible struggle is mistaken for peace. By the time the pattern becomes undeniable, the cost of speaking out is too high. People understand the rules now, even if they were never written down. Stay useful. Stay silent. Stay alive. This is the point of no return, not because escape is impossible, but because the social environment no longer supports collective action. Trust has been dismantled piece by piece. Information is compartmentalized. Individuals are isolated from one another emotionally and physically. Even those who recognize the system hesitate, because they cannot be sure who else sees it too. That uncertainty is not accidental. It is the system's greatest protection. Violence no longer needs to be frequent. The knowledge that it can be applied selectively is enough. The survivors are no longer simply enduring their environment. They are navigating a structure designed to benefit a small number at the expense of the rest. This is not madness. It is not desperation spiraling out of control. It is rational, calculated, and disturbingly effective. And because it is effective, it persists. Later, when accounts are reconstructed and judgments are made, it will be tempting to describe this phase as a descent into brutality. But that language misses the truth. What happened here was not a loss of order. It was the creation of a new one. An order in which violence was not an accident, but a tool. An order in which survival was no longer shared, but managed. And once violence becomes a system, it does not require cruelty to continue. It requires only compliance. Chapter 6. Proof that it wasn't inevitable. Even as control tightens and violence becomes structured, not everyone submits. Away from the main camps, on separate islands, and at the margins of the system, a small number of survivors begin to act differently. They do not announce resistance, and they do not confront authority directly. They do something far quieter and far more dangerous to the system that has formed. They organize without domination. These groups operate with limited resources and no claim to command, yet they function more effectively than those under enforced control. Decisions are shared. Information is passed openly. Tasks are distributed based on ability rather than obedience. Survival, in these spaces, does not depend on silence. It depends on cooperation. This difference matters because it demonstrates something essential. The conditions are the same. The environment is equally harsh. Food and water are no more abundant. And yet, the outcomes diverge. People in these smaller groups do not disappear without explanation. Death does not arrive selectively. When someone weakens, they are supported rather than removed. When danger appears, it is addressed collectively rather than exploited. There is no illusion of comfort here. Life remains difficult and uncertain, but it is not governed by fear. This contrast undermines the logic of the dominant system. It proves that violence was not a requirement of survival, but a choice shaped by power. Importantly, these resistant groups do not succeed because they are stronger or better equipped. They succeed because they preserve trust. Trust allows coordination. Coordination allows defense. Defense allows endurance. None of this is dramatic, and none of it attracts attention at first. That is why it lasts. While the central camps grow quieter and more controlled, these peripheral groups grow more resilient. They adapt without fragmenting. They make mistakes, but those mistakes are discussed rather than punished. Over time, this difference becomes impossible to ignore. When contact occurs between groups, the contrast is visible. One side operates through threat and restriction, the other through cooperation and shared responsibility. This moment is critical because it reframes everything that came before it. If survival without systemic violence is possible under the same conditions, then violence was never inevitable. It was never a consequence of nature alone. It was the result of decisions made in an environment where accountability had collapsed. This realization does not immediately dismantle the system of control. Systems built on fear are resistant to contradiction. But it introduces doubt, and doubt weakens authority in ways that force cannot easily counter. Those who control resources understand this instinctively. They respond by tightening restrictions, limiting contact, and reinforcing isolation. The goal is no longer just survival, but containment. Containment of information. Containment of alternatives. Containment of the idea that things could be different. Yet the existence of these alternative groups continues to matter, even if their influence is limited. They preserve a record of choice. They demonstrate that human behavior under pressure is not singular, that people do not inevitably descend into cruelty when structure disappears. The story of the Batavia is often told as an example of what happens when civilization collapses. This chapter challenges that interpretation. Civilization did not collapse everywhere. In some places, it was deliberately dismantled. In others, it was quietly rebuilt in miniature. The difference between these outcomes is not the environment, but the structure of relationships. Where power concentrated, violence followed. Where power was distributed, survival remained shared. This distinction is uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of inevitability. It suggests that the worst outcomes were not accidents of circumstance, but products of human organization. For the viewer, this is the point where the narrative shifts from observation to implication. If things could have unfolded differently here, then the story is no longer about extreme conditions alone. It is about choices made under those conditions, and about how easily people accept certain outcomes as natural when they are not. The existence of resistance does not undo the damage already done. It does not save everyone, but it changes the meaning of what happened. It turns the story from a tragedy imposed by fate into a record of competing systems. One built on fear and control, the other on cooperation and shared risk. Both existed at the same time, in the same place. Only one required violence to survive. Chapter 7. Rescue arrives to the wrong story. When the rescue finally arrives, it does not come with urgency or alarm. The ship approaches the islands expecting survivors weakened by hunger and exposure, not a fractured society shaped by control and violence. From the deck, the scene appears quiet. There is no chaos, no visible conflict, no immediate sign that anything is wrong. This initial calm reinforces expectation. Rescue crews believe they are arriving at the end of a survival story, not the middle of something far more complex. As contact is made, survivors emerge cautiously, offering fragments of information shaped by fear, habit, and uncertainty. No single account explains what happened. Stories overlap, but do not align. Some deaths are mentioned casually. Others are omitted entirely. The absence of open accusation is striking. It suggests exhaustion rather than relief. As the rescuers move inland, the discrepancy between what they expected to find and what is actually present becomes impossible to ignore. Camps are unevenly populated. Supplies are controlled, not shared. Some people appear well-fed while others are noticeably weakened. Entire groups are missing. Questions arise, but answers are slow and incomplete. What becomes clear first is not the scale of violence, but its organization. Deaths are not random. They follow lines of exclusion and selection. This realization unfolds gradually as testimonies accumulate and physical evidence contradicts initial explanations. The rescuers begin to understand that they are not uncovering isolated incidents, but the remnants of a system that functioned in their absence. The shock does not come from brutality alone, but from structure. Violence has left patterns behind it. These patterns are legible. They reveal intent. As the days pass, the narrative of simple survival collapses. Witnesses are separated. Accounts are compared. Confessions emerge, some voluntarily, others under pressure. What initially seemed like reluctance to speak reveals itself as fear of reprisal. Even now, the system that governed the islands has not fully dissolved. It lingers in behavior, in silence, in the way people hesitate before answering direct questions. Rescue does not immediately restore clarity. It exposes damage, but it does not erase its effects. For those who controlled resources and decisions, the arrival of authority represents not relief, but reckoning. For others, it is the first moment they feel protected enough to speak. The imbalance in reactions is telling. Slowly, the outline of what occurred becomes visible, not as a single narrative, but as a convergence of fragments that point in the same direction. The rescuers realize they have arrived too late to prevent the worst outcomes, but not too late to document them. This distinction matters. The presence of an external authority does not undo what happened, but it reintroduces accountability. Actions that were once framed as necessity are now examined as choices. Explanations that relied on circumstance lose their power. The story shifts again from survival to judgment. Yet even here, there is no clean resolution. The damage inflicted on trust, on relationships, and on the understanding of what occurred cannot be repaired quickly. Rescue ends the physical isolation, but the psychological separation remains. Those who survived under control must now learn how to exist without it. Those who resisted must explain how they did so. And those who enforced the system must face the reality that what functioned in isolation does not survive exposure. The rescue ship did not arrive to save a group of stranded people. It arrived to uncover the consequences of what happens when authority disappears and is replaced by something far more dangerous. The story it expected to conclude no longer exists. In its place is one that demands explanation. Chapter 8. What was officially recorded? What follows the rescue is not clarity, but documentation. Statements are taken. Names are listed. Events are ordered into sequences that can be written down, reviewed, and archived. The story begins to change shape, not because the facts are disputed, but because they must now fit the structure of official record. Testimonies are filtered through language that seeks responsibility rather than understanding. Actions are categorized. Guilt is assigned. The complexity of what occurred on the islands is gradually reduced into something that can be judged, punished, and closed. This process is necessary, but it is not neutral. It favors what can be proven over what can be felt, and what can be written over what was lived. The system that failed on the islands reasserts itself through procedure. Authority returns in the form of courts and reports, replacing improvised power with formal judgment. Individuals who orchestrated violence are identified and prosecuted. Sentences are passed. On paper, order is restored. Yet the record does not fully capture how that order collapsed in the first place. It cannot describe the silence that allowed decisions to go unchallenged, or the gradual normalization of death that made violence invisible until it was too late. Those details do not translate easily into legal language. They remain between the lines, implied but unaddressed. History prefers resolution. It prefers identifiable villains and clear outcomes. And so, the Batavia becomes a case study in mutiny and brutality, rather than a demonstration of how fragile systems can be when authority exists without accountability. The official record preserves what happened, but not why it was possible. It notes that violence occurred, but not how it became acceptable. It documents the end of the story, but not the quiet moments where it could have gone another way. Over time, the narrative hardens. The shipwreck becomes the beginning. The executions become the conclusion. Everything in between is compressed into inevitability. This simplification is not malicious. It is efficient. It allows the story to be remembered without discomfort. But something important is lost in that efficiency. The existence of alternative outcomes, the small groups who survived without domination, the moments where trust still functioned, receives less attention because it complicates the lesson. If violence was not inevitable, then responsibility does not end with a few individuals. It extends to structures, to assumptions, to the ways people respond to uncertainty when oversight disappears. That is a harder truth to preserve. And so, the official version settles into place, stable and complete. The Batavia is remembered as a tragedy of extreme circumstances, rather than a warning about what fills the space when authority leaves and nothing replaces it. The record closes the case, but it does not answer the most important question the story raises. Not who was guilty or who deserved punishment, but how ordinary people, under familiar pressures, came to accept a system that rewarded silence and punished dissent. That question remains unresolved, not because the evidence is missing, but because it does not belong to the archive. It belongs to the reader, to the viewer, to anyone who recognizes that the conditions that shaped this story are not confined to the past. The Batavia did not reveal something monstrous and alien. It revealed something ordinary and therefore unsettling. When the documentation ends, the implications do not. History records what happened. Understanding requires asking what was allowed to happen. And that difference is where this story truly ends.